The dress was the first thing Roy Whittaker noticed, and the moment his eyes landed on it, every muscle in his body went still as winter ground. He had been leaning against the post outside Hargrove's General Store on the main stretch of Caldwell, Kansas, one boot crossed over the other, watching the afternoon train roll to a stop at the depot the way he did most Tuesdays when there was nothing pressing on the ranch. It was the summer of 1882, and Caldwell sat right on the Kansas Indian Territory border like a man straddling a fence, loud and dusty, and full of cattlemen, gamblers, and folks passing through with no intention of staying. Roy had lived here long enough to know the difference between people running towards something and people running from it. The woman who stepped off the last car of that Union Pacific train was unmistakably the second kind. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with dark hair pinned up in a way that had not survived the journey intact. Loose strands fell across her cheeks, and she held a single carpetbag in both hands like she was afraid someone might snatch it from her. Her boots were wrong for the terrain, low-heeled city shoes that would be dust-caked before she reached the end of the platform. But none of that was what stopped Roy cold. It was the dress. It was green calico with ivory piping along the collar and two small mother-of-pearl buttons at each cuff. There was a small mend near the left hip, almost invisible unless you knew to look, where the seam had been let out just slightly. Roy knew to look. He had watched those buttons catch the lamplight in his kitchen on 100 different evenings. He had watched those same hands at those same cuffs pour coffee and fold biscuit dough and reach across the supper table. The dress had belonged to his sister, Clara. Clara Whittaker had died of typhoid fever 11 months ago, and Roy had given her things to the church relief box in Wichita when he had ridden through in the spring, because he had not been able to stand looking at them anymore. The woman on the platform had not seen him yet. She was scanning the crowd with wide, uncertain eyes that Roy could tell from 20 feet away were trying very hard not to look frightened. She was failing. Her jaw was set too tight, and her shoulders were pulled up too close to her ears, and she kept shifting the weight of that carpetbag from one hand to the other, in a way that suggested she had been holding it for a very long time and was too proud to set it down. Roy pushed off the post and walked toward the depot. He was 30 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of ranch work, with sun-dark skin and dark brown hair that needed cutting and a jawline that his mother had once called stubborn, and meant it as both a compliment and a complaint. He wore his work clothes because he always wore his work clothes, canvas trousers and a plain shirt, and his good leather vest that he kept for town days. His hat brim was pulled low against the afternoon glare. He stopped at the edge of the platform steps and looked up at her. She looked down at him, and something in her expression shifted between wariness and exhaustion, like she had been hoping for someone specific and was now calculating whether this stranger presented danger. "You looking for someone?" Roy asked. "I was told to present myself to Mr. Calloway at this depot," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a rawness underneath it, the kind that comes from crying that has long since gone dry. He was to arrange lodging. Roy knew Hector Calloway. Hector Calloway was the employment agent who placed domestic workers and sometimes arranged more dubious things, and he had left for Dodge City 3 days ago on account of a horse deal that had gone sideways. He would not be back for another week at minimum. "Calloway's gone to Dodge," Roy said. She blinked. Just once slowly, the way someone blinks when they are absorbing a piece of information that changes everything, and are too tired to react to it the way they would have 6 months ago when the world still made sense. "Gone," she repeated. "For a week, maybe more." She looked down at the carpetbag. Then she looked at the platform around her, at the men loitering with horses and the women moving briskly past in groups of 2 and 3, at the depot building with its cracked paint and single wooden bench that already held a sleeping old man. She looked at the town of Caldwell, spreading out beyond the depot in a single long commercial street, and a grid of smaller buildings behind it, practical and graceless and utterly indifferent to her arrival. "I see," she said, and the words were quiet and completely composed, and Roy recognized that composure for what it was, because he had worn it himself for the better part of a year. It was the composure of someone who had nothing left to be undone by. "That dress belonged to my sister," he said. He had not planned to say it. It came out of him the way things sometimes do when you have been quiet for a long time, simply and without decoration. She looked at him sharply, and the composure cracked just slightly at the edges. Her hand went to the fabric at her hip almost instinctively, fingers pressing against that small mended seam. "I bought it from a church box in Wichita," she said quickly. "There were 3 dresses and I only had enough coin for one. I didn't know who it had belonged to. I can pay you back for it, I just don't have the money right now, but I will, I swear it, I'm not a thief." "I didn't say you were," Roy said. "You looked like you were thinking it." "I was thinking about my sister," he said. "That's different." She held his gaze for a moment, and something in the air between them settled slightly, like dust after a horse has passed. "I'm sorry about your sister," she said, and she meant it. He could hear that she meant it. "Keep the dress," Roy said. She would have wanted someone to get use from it. Clara was practical that way. He paused. "I'm Roy Whittaker. My ranch is about 4 miles north of town." "Opal Hadley," she said. "I don't know anyone in this town, and I have approximately 60 cents to my name and no idea where to sleep tonight." Roy looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Calloway, gone to Dodge. He thought about his ranch house, which had a spare room that had once been his sister's room and had been empty since last September. He thought about the fact that this woman was standing on a platform in his dead sister's dress and looking at him with eyes that were exhausted and proud in equal measure, and something in his chest that had been very quiet for a long time made a small, insistent sound. "Come inside," he said. "The hotel on 2nd Street does a decent supper, and you look like you haven't eaten today. We can figure out the rest after." She looked at him with the careful assessment of a woman who has learned that offers from strangers rarely arrive without cost. "Why?" she asked plainly. "Because you're in my sister's dress and you've got 60 cents and nowhere to go," Roy said. "And because Caldwell is no place to be alone after dark if you don't know where you're standing." She considered this for what felt like a full minute. Then she picked up her carpetbag and walked down the platform steps. "All right, Mr. Whittaker," she said. "Lead the way." The hotel dining room on 2nd Street was run by a wide woman named Dolores Marsh, who cooked everything in bacon grease and served it without apology. And Roy had eaten there often enough after Clara died that Dolores knew his order without asking. She raised an eyebrow when he walked in with a woman she didn't recognize, but she was too busy with the supper rush to do more than set them at the corner table and bring 2 plates of beef stew with cornbread. Opal ate the way people eat when they are very hungry and have been pretending not to be. She took careful, measured bites at first, the kind designed to look unhurried, and then the pretense fell away and she ate with the focused efficiency of real hunger, and Roy looked out the window to give her the privacy of it. When the plates were mostly cleared, he asked where she had come from. "Missouri," she said. "St. Louis originally. Before that, a small town called Carterville that you have never heard of." "What brought you to Caldwell?" She set down her spoon and looked at him directly, deciding something. Calloway's agency advertised for a domestic worker with a placement family in Caldwell. I answered the advertisement 3 months ago. I've been making my way here in stages because I couldn't afford the full fare all at once. Roy nodded slowly. "You don't have family in Missouri." "I have a stepfather in Carterville," she said, and the way she said it answered several questions he had not yet asked. "And an older brother in St. Louis who has his own family and not much room." She folded her hands on the table. "I am not running from anything dramatic, Mr. Whittaker. I am simply a woman of 22 with limited options who decided that a Western territory might offer more than a Missouri one. That is the whole of it." "That seems honest enough," he said. "I find honesty is more efficient than pretending," she said. "What about you? You own a ranch 4 miles out. Are you married?" "No," he said. "Widowed?" "No, just never quite got there." "How old are you?" 30, she nodded as though filing the information. "And you live alone. I have 2 ranch hands who bunk on the property, Roy said. Pete Vargas and a younger fellow named Silas Dunn. They do the heavy work. I run the cattle operation myself. Is it a good ranch? The question surprised him slightly, not in its directness but in what it was clearly calculating. She was not making conversation. She was assessing. It's a working ranch, he said. Not wealthy but solid. About 300 head. Good water access. And the spare room you were going to offer me, she said carefully. What is the nature of that offer, Mr. Whitaker? Roy met her eyes and respected the question for what it was. Clara's old room, he said. Separate, with a lock on the door that I had put in myself when she moved in because she asked for it and she was right to ask. You'd have it in the same condition. In exchange for honest domestic work, cooking, cleaning, whatever needs doing in the house, room and board, while you wait for Calloway to return and sort out your original placement. Nothing more and nothing less. Opal Hadley looked at him across the table in the lamplit hotel dining room, surrounded by the noise of cattlemen and the smell of bacon, grease, and coffee, and she made her assessment with the calm thoroughness of a woman who had made difficult calculations before. I accept, she said, on the condition that the agreement ends cleanly the moment Calloway returns, with no ill feeling on either side, and that I have the use of that lock whenever I choose. Those are fair terms, Roy said. Then we have an arrangement, Mr. Whitaker. He brought the wagon around from the livery at the end of the street where he had left it that morning, and helped her up onto the bench with a brief, businesslike offer of his hand, which she took with equal brevity. The drive north in the evening light was quiet at first, the Kansas grassland stretching out on both sides of the road in long golden waves that the setting sun turned almost amber, and the sky above was enormous and deeply blue, the kind of sky that makes people who have grown up under smaller ones feel briefly unmoored. Opal sat with her carpetbag on her knees and watched the landscape with an expression that Roy couldn't quite read. It wasn't fear and it wasn't wonder exactly. It was something more like recognition, as though some part of her had been expecting this specific kind of open space. It's bigger than I thought it would be, she said after a while. It is that, Roy agreed. In St. Louis there's always something in the way, she said. A building or a hill or another street you can never quite see very far. Does that bother you, being able to see far now? She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. I think it might be the opposite of bothersome. The ranch house came into view as they crested a gentle rise, a solid 2-story structure of stone and wood that Roy's father had built and Roy had added to over the years. There was a barn and a smaller bunkhouse set back to the east, and the whole property was surrounded by the kind of deliberate, unglamorous order that comes from a man who takes his work seriously. A lamp was burning in the bunkhouse window, which meant Pete or Silas was awake, and the horses in the near paddock lifted their heads as the wagon rolled in. Opal looked at the house with quiet attention. It's a good house, she said. It serves, Roy said, and he was aware of a faint warmth at the simple comment that he chose to ignore. He showed her the house with the efficient tour of a man who does not think much about the aesthetics of the place he lives in, pointing out the kitchen and its layout, the parlor with its one decent chair and its shelves of practical books, the wood stove and the water pump and the cellar where the preserves and the root vegetables lived. When he opened the door to Clara's room, he did it without ceremony, and she stepped inside and looked around. It was a plain room with a single bed and a washstand, and a window that faced east so it caught the morning light. Clara's few personal items had been removed, but the quilt on the bed was still the one she had made herself, blue and white in a log cabin pattern, and the curtains were still the ones she had sewn from flour sacks and dyed with indigo. Roy noticed Opal's eyes move to the quilt and stay there for a moment. I'll bring fresh water up for the washstand in the morning, he said. Thank you, she said. Her voice was slightly different in this room, softer. The lock is there, he said, gesturing to the sturdy bolt on the inside of the door. Bedroom next to this one is mine. Pete and Silas stay in the bunkhouse. Breakfast in this house is generally at 6 unless there's a drive. If you want to cook it, I won't say no, but there's no expectation of it your first night." "I'll manage," she said. He nodded. He was halfway out the door when she spoke again. "Mr. Whitaker," he turned. "Thank you," she said, and there was a weight behind the words that made them different from simple courtesy. "Not just for the supper, for all of it. I know it's an unusual circumstance." "It's an unusual territory," he said. "Good night, Miss Hadley." "Good night." He heard the bolt slide home behind him as he walked down the hall, and he found himself thinking that the sound of it was both correct and, in some way he could not have explained, comforting. The first morning was careful and slightly formal, the way mornings are between people who have not yet established their shared rhythms. Opal was already in the kitchen when Roy came down at 10 minutes past 5, which told him she was an early riser or that she had not slept well, and the fire was already going in the stove and there was coffee on. She was moving through the kitchen with the focused attention of someone learning a new system, opening cabinet doors and closing them, examining the provisions, assessing the tools available. She had changed out of Clara's dress, which he noticed without comment, and was wearing a plain gray dress that she must have had in the carpet bag. Her hair was braided simply and pinned at the back of her head. She looked in the early morning light like someone who had arrived after a very long journey and had decided to stop traveling. "The coffee is stronger than you probably take it," she said without turning around. "I didn't know your preference." "I take it however it comes," Roy said, and poured himself a cup. She turned from the stove with a cast iron pan in her hand and looked at him with the calm practicality that was already becoming familiar. "What are the working hours on this ranch, and what do you eat?" He told her, straightforwardly and without embellishment, and she listened the way efficient people listen, absorbing the information and organizing it simultaneously. By the time Pete Vargas knocked on the kitchen door at 5:30 in the manner he always had when Clara was alive, expecting to be fed alongside Roy, Opal had produced a skillet of eggs and salt pork and a fresh pan of cornbread from the provisions in the cellar, and Pete stopped in the doorway and blinked at her with undisguised surprise. Pete Vargas was 35, stocky and dark-haired, the son of a Mexican vaquero who had drifted north, and he had been with Roy for 7 years. He was a good hand and a decent man, and he was incapable of being anything other than transparent about what he was thinking, which Roy had always considered both a virtue and an occasional inconvenience. "Well," Pete said, and that was all he said, but his eyebrows communicated the rest. Silas Dunn came in behind Pete, younger by a decade, a tall and slightly awkward young man from Tennessee, who went red at any interaction with women, and spent most of his working hours in a state of cheerful incompetence that somehow never prevented the work from getting done. Roy made brief introductions and watched Opal handle both men with the same calm, direct manner she had applied to him, without flirtation and without frost, simply clear and self-possessed, and Pete's eyebrows slowly settled into their normal position, and Silas turned red and focused on his eggs. After breakfast, Roy went out to the day's work, and Opal set about the systematic business of learning the house. Over the next several days, a routine emerged with the organic naturalness of two people who happened to be competent in complementary ways. Opal was an excellent cook, which Roy acknowledged with genuine appreciation, and she had strong instincts about the ordering of a household, knowing without being told which things needed doing first. She went through the house in those first days like weather, cleaning and reorganizing and mending with a thoroughness that was not intrusive but was thorough, and Roy found himself coming in from the ranch at midday to a kitchen that smelled of bread and a house that had a quality of settled livability it had been missing since before Clara died. He made a point of not taking her labor for granted. He said thank you when it was warranted, which was often, and he asked her opinion when he ran into domestic questions, and he made sure she had what she needed, including a trip to Hargrove's in town that second week to replenish supplies and somewhat awkwardly but because he felt it was right, to offer her a small wage from his operating funds. "That wasn't the agreement," she said, when he put the coins on the kitchen table. "The agreement was room and board," he said. "This is extra. For the quality of the work. There's a difference between the basics of an arrangement and what's earned beyond it." She looked at the coins and then at him, and the look on her face was complicated in a way he couldn't quite parse. She picked them up. "Thank you," she said. The town of Caldwell had opinions, as towns always do. Dolar's Marsh at the hotel made a comment to another woman that was reported back to Roy by Pete with some embarrassment. The banker's wife nodded at Opal on the street with a smile that had a question mark built into it. The pastor's wife came to call under the pretext of welcoming a newcomer to the community, and spent 45 minutes asking questions that were very carefully not the questions she actually wanted to ask. Opal handled all of it with what Roy privately began to think of as her best tool, which was simply being exactly what she appeared to be. She was polite to the pastor's wife, and answered her questions directly and gave her nothing to work with. And the pastor's wife went away without her gossip, but also without anything damaging to report. One afternoon in her second week, Roy came in from the north field earlier than expected, because one of the fence posts had needed a repair that took less time than anticipated, and he found Opal sitting at the kitchen table with Clara's green dress spread open in front of her. She was not mending it. She was looking at it with an expression that was private and contemplative, the expression of someone having a conversation with themselves. He stopped in the doorway and she looked up. "I was wondering if I should offer it back," she said, without pretense. "Every time I look at it I wonder if you'd rather have it. Even if you gave it away, sometimes you make decisions you later reconsider." Roy came into the kitchen and pulled out the chair across from her. "My sister was 26 when she died," he said. "She came out here from Ohio after our parents passed, said she wanted something different from the life she'd been living. She helped me build this place into what it is. She made that quilt in your room and those curtains and most of what makes this house feel like a house rather than a shelter." He paused. "I gave her things away because I couldn't stand seeing them hang still, but you wearing that dress is different from it hanging still. She'd have been pleased by that distinction." Opal looked at him steadily. "How long were you two out here together?" "4 years. You must miss her every day." "Every single day," he said simply. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Opal smoothed the green calico with the flat of her hand, a gesture that was unconsciously tender. "I had a younger sister," she said. "She died when she was 8, scarlet fever. Her name was June." She paused. "I don't think grief ever quite closes up. I think it just becomes part of the architecture of who you are." Roy looked at her across the table in the afternoon light with her dark hair and her direct eyes and her hands resting on his dead sister's dress, and he felt something shift in him that he had no immediate words for, only the recognition that it was there and that it mattered. "No," he said. "I don't think it closes up either." At the end of the second week, a letter arrived from Calloway's agency. Roy brought it in from town on a Friday and handed it to Opal at supper without opening it, which she noted with a small, approving look. She read it and her expression went through several quiet variations in rapid succession. "The placement fell through," she said. "The family I was assigned to has taken a different domestic worker, someone local. Calloway's agency apologizes and offers a small reimbursement of my travel cost, which will arrive in approximately 4 to 6 weeks. She set the letter on the table. "So I have no placement, and the reimbursement isn't enough to get me anywhere useful even if it comes." Roy kept his expression neutral, while something behind it was doing something considerably less neutral. "What are your options?" "My realistic options," Opal said, in the tone of someone who has already catalogued them, "are to look for employment in Caldwell, which is limited, to return to St. Louis on credit, which I would rather not do, or to renegotiate our current arrangement, which is what I would prefer if you're amenable." "What would a renegotiated arrangement look like?" "Longer term," she said. "A proper wage in addition to room and board, agreed in writing, with the same terms about the room and the lock." and the understanding that I am here as a working person earning my keep, not as a charity case." Roy looked at her across the table, this woman who had arrived 11 days ago in his dead sister's dress with 60 cents and nowhere to go, who had reorganized his kitchen and made his house smell like bread again, and handled Caldwell's curiosity with more grace than he managed most of the time. "I can agree to that," he said. She put her hand across the table and he shook it, and the touch of her hand was warm and firm and brief, and he was aware of it for longer than he thought he would be. The weeks that followed had a quality that Roy would later look back on as the clearest time of his life, not because it was uncomplicated, but because it was very real. Opal settled into the ranch with a kind of quiet competence that was easy to be around. She was not a woman who required conversation for the sake of it, which suited Roy's own preference for productive silence. But when they did talk, at breakfast before the hands arrived or at the supper table in the evenings, the conversation was the kind that covers ground, moving between the practical and the personal with the natural ease of two people who have stopped performing for each other. He learned that she had grown up in Carterville in conditions that were not impoverished exactly, but were constricted, that her stepfather was a severe man with a talent for making people feel that their existence was a minor inconvenience, that she had educated herself primarily through the town library and through the determined application of native intelligence, and that she had left Missouri with no plan beyond the knowledge that staying was no longer a possibility she could tolerate. She learned about Roy's cattle operation in gradual detail because she asked smart questions, and he found it natural to answer them. She learned about his father, who had been a hard man in the good sense of the word, honest and demanding and fair, who had built the stone foundation of this house with his own hands, and had died of a heart attack the winter Roy was 25. She learned about the Cheyenne rights disputes that had reshaped the territory in the last decade, because Roy talked about them with the specific discomfort of a man who knows an injustice is happening within a system he operates inside of, and who has the self-awareness to be troubled by that fact even when he cannot change it. The land he ranched on had been contested, and the resolution of that contest had not been just, and he named that plainly rather than papering over it, which told her something important about who he was. She told him she respected him for that naming. He told her that respect without action was limited in its worth, but that he had not figured out the action part yet and was still working on it. She said that was the most honest thing a person could say and meant it as praise. One evening in late August, 3 weeks after she had arrived, there was a thunderstorm that rolled in from the southwest with the dramatic speed of a Kansas Plains storm, dropping from a clearish sky to a full-throated rage in less than half an hour. Roy was in the barn with Pete seeing to a heifer that had been limping on her back left leg, and Opal was in the house when the lightning started. By the time the rain came down in earnest, the kitchen was lit with the yellow lamp, and she had moved sensibly away from the windows and was sitting at the table with a mending basket. Roy came in from the barn soaked through and went to pull his boots off at the door, and she was already up getting a towel before he had finished with the second boot. She handed it to him without fuss and went back to the kitchen for coffee, and he dried his face and hair and came to stand at the edge of the kitchen, and the storm was enormous and dark outside the windows, and the kitchen was warm and lamplit, and there was coffee on, and Opal was sitting at the table with her mending, and there was a domesticity to the moment that hit Roy somewhere behind the sternum with a force he had not been prepared for. He sat down with his coffee, and the storm rattled the windows, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then she looked up from the mending and found him watching her, and there was a beat of stillness between them that was new. She looked at her mending. He looked at his coffee. "The heifer's going to be all right," he said. "Good," she said. The storm went on for another hour, and he stayed at the kitchen table for most of it, and the silence between them had a different quality after that beat, warmer and more careful at the same time, like something that had been named without words. In September, A man named Dale Whittington arrived at the ranch on a gray horse with bad manners. He was the representative of a cattle-buying consortium out of Wichita, and his business with Roy was the kind of negotiation that Roy had handled a dozen times before, the kind where someone comes in with a low number in confidence, and you spend 2 hours getting them to a number that is fair. What made this particular afternoon different was that Whittington spent most of the 2 hours in Roy's parlor finding reasons to go to the kitchen and chat with Opal. Roy noticed. Pete noticed. Silas noticed so obviously that Roy had to give him a look across the yard to settle him down. After Whittington left with a deal that was reasonable but below what Roy had wanted, Roy went to the kitchen and Opal was washing the cups from the coffee she had been prevailed upon to serve, and she looked at him when he came in and said, "He's not going to offer you the full fair price until he's sure you're not desperate, and he doesn't believe you're not desperate yet. He'll come back." "I know," Roy said. "He also thought being pleasant to me would soften your position," she said calmly. "I know that too." She turned back to the cups. "I hope you're not annoyed at me for talking to him. I kept the conversation to things that wouldn't give anything away." "I'm not annoyed at you at all," Roy said. And then, because it had been sitting in him and the moment seemed to have the kind of openness that permits honesty, he said, "I didn't like watching him try to use you, though, that I'll admit." She turned around slowly. The look she gave him was searching and also, he thought, slightly pleased. "He didn't use me," she said. "He tried and didn't succeed. Those are different things." "Yes," Roy said, "they are." The following week, Whittington came back and Roy got within $20 of what he wanted, and he considered that a satisfactory conclusion. The first time Roy touched Opal in any way beyond the briefest practicality was entirely accidental, and was, as these things often are, more consequential than any deliberate gesture could have been. They were in the cellar together on a Sunday afternoon in late September, taking stock of the winter provisions, when Opal reached for a high shelf and her heel turned on the uneven stone floor. She caught herself immediately, one hand shooting to the shelf for balance, but Roy's hand was already at her elbow, steadying, an instinct faster than thought. She did not pull away immediately. There was a half-second in which his hand was on her arm and she was balanced against it, and they were both in the low-lit cellar surrounded by the smell of root vegetables and preserved fruit, and in that half-second, Roy was aware of her warmth and the slim solidity of her arm and the way she turned her head to look at him. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was quieter than usual. He released her arm. "Careful on that floor," he said. "It's worse on the left side." "I'll remember," she said, and turned back to the shelving with a composure that was real, he thought, but working slightly harder than normal. He thought about that half-second for the better part of 2 days. In October, a letter arrived from Opal's stepfather. Roy did not know about this letter until 2 days after it arrived, when he came in from a fence repair in the late afternoon and found Opal in the kitchen not cooking, which was unusual. She was sitting very still at the table with her hands in her lap, and her face had a closed-down quality that made Roy stop in the doorway. "Bad news?" he asked. She looked up. "My stepfather," she said. "He writes to tell me that as I have not contributed to the household since I left, he is selling my mother's small collection of books, which I had stored at the house, with the expectation of sending for them when I had a permanent address. He makes clear this is punitive." Roy came to the table. "Are they valuable, the books?" "Not in money," she said quietly. "They were my mother's. She died when I was 14. They're the only things of hers I have left." Roy sat down. He looked at Opal's face, which was holding itself in the careful composure he had come to know was her armor against things that were genuinely wounding her. "How many books?" "About 30. Some novels, some poetry, a natural history book that she loved particularly." She paused. "He'll sell them for almost nothing because he doesn't know their value and wouldn't care if he did. They'll disappear into some second-hand dealer's lot in Carterville." Roy thought for a moment. "If I wire ahead to Carterville and arrange payment for the lot, could you get someone there to hold them until you can arrange shipping?" She looked at him with an expression that was startled and then carefully guarded, the guardedness of someone who has been disappointed by apparent offers of help before. "That would cost you money," she said. "Not very much," he said. 30 books and a shipping cost. How much is he likely to want for them?" "He would take $2 just to be rid of them and could claim he'd gotten a good price." "Wire your brother in St. Louis," Roy said. "Ask him to visit Carterville and pay the $2 and hold them until they can be shipped here. I'll cover the cost of shipping when they arrive. You can repay me from your wages over time if it makes you feel better about the arrangement." She looked at him for a long, still moment, and he watched something behind her eyes shift in a way that was difficult to name exactly but was unmistakably significant. "Why are you this kind?" she said quietly, and the question was not rhetorical. It was genuine. She wanted to know. Roy considered the question honestly. "My mother raised me to look at what's in front of you and do the practical right thing," he said. "Your mother's books shouldn't be scattered to some dealer's lot in Carterville because your stepfather is mean-spirited. That's what's in front of me. The rest of it is just wire fees and shipping." Opal looked at her hands in her lap. When she looked up, there was a brightness in her eyes that was not quite tears and was something more fundamental than gratitude. "I'll write to my brother tonight," she said. "Good," said Roy. The books arrived on the 1st of November in 2 wooden crates, and when Roy carried them into the parlor and set them on the table and Opal opened the first crate, she was silent for a long moment as she went through them, running her fingers across the spines with a reverence that was entirely unconscious. She picked up the natural history book, a worn volume with a faded illustration of a bird on the cover, and held it in both hands the way you hold something you thought you had lost. Roy watched from the doorway. When she looked up at him, her face was open in a way it had not been before, open and warm and undefended, and she said, "Thank you, Roy." And it was the first time she had used his first name, and they both noticed it and neither of them mentioned it. "You're welcome, Opal," he said, and her name and his voice had the same quality. November came in cold and decisive the way Kansas Novembers do. The cattle drive to Wichita that Roy had been planning through most of September and October required 4 days of hard riding, and Pete went along and Silas held the near pasture. And while Roy was away, Opal ran the household with her characteristic competence, and also, he suspected based on the evidence of a repaired fence post and a patched chicken coop, had found other things to do with her time. He was away for a week, including the drive and the return, and the day he rode back into the yard he was colder than he had expected, and the horse was tired, and Roy himself was in the peculiar state of return that he had never quite been able to explain, a heightened awareness of the familiar that makes everything you usually take for granted appear newly clear. The lamp in the kitchen was lit. Smoke from the stove chimney rose straight up in the still cold air. The horse moved into the yard, and Opal appeared in the kitchen doorway before he had dismounted, and she looked at him with an expression that was simple and complete, a look that said she had been aware of his absence and was straightforwardly glad he was back. He got the horse to the barn, and Pete followed, and they unsaddled in the easy quiet of men who have worked together long enough not to need words, and when Roy came to the kitchen door and pulled off his hat and coat, there was supper on and the kitchen was warm, and Opal turned from the stove and said, "How did the price hold?" "Better than last year," he said. 62 a head average. She turned back to the stove with the small, satisfied nod of someone who has been paying attention to the numbers. He sat down at the table, and there was something in the sitting that was different from before he left, a settling into the chair that was also a settling toward a person, toward the specific reality of her presence in this kitchen. And he knew that he had thought about her while he was away in a way that was more than the ordinary thought of a man for his household. He thought about her at night in the Cattle Town hotel room. He thought about her on the ride and wondered if she had slept all right in the empty house. He thought about her sharp, clear mind and her mother's natural history book and her hands on the green calico dress. He did not act on any of this thinking for another full month, because Roy Whittaker was a careful man, and she was a woman living under his roof with a lock on her door for good reasons. And there was a correct way to do things, and he intended to do them correctly. In December, Pete Vargas had an accident with a fence post that resulted in a broken wrist, which was painful and inconvenient but not dangerous. He was laid up at the bunkhouse for 10 days, and during those 10 days Opal went to him morning and evening with food, and the particular straightforward care of someone who takes the health of people in her household seriously regardless of their formal relationship to her. Pete was a reserved man when it came to expressing anything that looked like gratitude, but on the third day he said to Roy with great seriousness, "She's good, Roy, the real kind of good, not the performing kind." Roy said, "I know." "You know what else I know," Pete said. "I expect you're going to tell me." "She looks at you," Pete said. "When you're not looking, she looks at you in a way that I have seen women look at men I know, and it never turns out to be nothing." Roy was quiet for a moment. "My situation with her is specific," he said. "She came here by a difficult road and she lives in my house and her options are limited. I won't take advantage of any of that." "I didn't say take advantage," Pete said, with the patience of a man with a broken wrist who has nothing to do but be clear. "I said she looks at you. Which means it's not one-sided, which means it's something else entirely." Roy thought about that for a long time. It was a Friday evening in the second week of December when the thing that had been accumulating between them finally broke through the surface. Roy had come in from checking on the South herd and found Opal in the parlor, which was unusual. She was reading one of her mother's novels in the parlor's one good chair with her feet tucked under her, and the lamp pulled close. And she looked up when he came in, and she had the look of someone who has been absorbed in a good story and has not fully returned to the room yet. And Roy thought, looking at her in the lamplight with her dark hair slightly loose and her book on her lap, that she was one of the most genuinely beautiful things he had ever seen in his life. The thought arrived with perfect clarity and no fanfare. He hung up his coat and his hat and came into the parlor instead of going to the kitchen as he usually did, and she watched him cross the room and sit on the wooden chair he usually avoided because it was uncomfortable. "Good book," he said. "Jane Eyre," she said. "I've read it 4 times. I still find new things." He looked at her. "What do you find?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "That a person can deserve more than their circumstances have offered them," she said. "And that knowing you deserve more doesn't make it easier to ask for it. That's what strikes me most on each reading, the difficulty of asking for what you need." The room was quiet. The lamp made a warm circle. Outside, the Kansas winter was just beginning to assert itself, a cold that was settling in for the long season. "Opal," Roy said. She looked at him. "There's something I've been working out how to say correctly," he said. "And I want to say it correctly because the situation between us is one where I am aware that the power is not equal, and I don't want to do something wrong in either direction." She was very still. "I have been," Roy said carefully, "growing in my regard for you in a way that has moved beyond what a man feels for a good employee or a valued housemate." He looked at her directly. "I think you are remarkable, Opal. I think you are honest and brave and intelligent, and I have been happier in this house this past autumn than I have been in longer than I can easily say. And I want you to know that, with the understanding that there is no expectation in it. Your position here doesn't depend on what you do with what I've told you. The room and the wages and the lock are yours regardless. I just think you deserve to know where I am." The silence lasted 10 full seconds. "That is," Opal said slowly, "the most careful declaration I have ever been given." "I wanted to be careful," Roy said. "I know," she said. "I know why. And I want you to know that I am aware of the situation, Roy. I am aware that I came here with nothing and that you gave me something, and that those facts could very easily distort what I feel." She paused. "But I am also a woman who does not confuse gratitude with love. And I know the difference between feeling safe somewhere because there is food and a roof, and feeling safe somewhere because the person in it is someone you want to be around regardless of the food and the roof." Roy held very still. "I would want to be around you," Opal said, "even if none of the rest of it existed. I want you to know that." Roy stood from the uncomfortable chair and crossed the room and stood in front of her, and Opal put her book on the side table and looked up at him, and he offered her his hand in the same direct, uncomplicated way he offered his hand for everything important, and she took it and stood, and he was quite close to her and neither of them stepped back. "What do you want?" he said, because it was the right question. "You," she said simply, and the simplicity of it was perfect. He kissed her with the same careful quality that he did everything. First, just the press of it, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. And when she did not change her mind and instead brought her free hand up to his jaw, the care dissolved into something warmer and more complete, and the parlor with its single lamp and the winter outside and Clara's old quilt visible through the bedroom door became the exact center of the world. They stayed in the parlor talking for 2 more hours, sitting close together now on the wooden bench that Roy dragged in front of the fire, and they talked the way people talk when a door has been opened, and there is no longer any reason to stand at a careful distance from it. She told him things she had not told him before about Carterville and her stepfather, and the particular loneliness of a household where your grief is treated as an inconvenience. He told her things about Clara and the years of quiet ranching, and the way his father's death had left him both free and without a template for what to do with that freedom. At midnight he walked her to her room door as he had always done, but this time there was a different quality to the good night, one that included the deliberate fact of her hand in his and then released. She did not bolt the lock that night. He knew because he had not heard it, and the not hearing it meant something that he chose to honor rather than to act on before the time was right. Christmas in 1882 in Caldwell, Kansas was a modest affair in most households, and Roy and Opal kept it accordingly. A good supper and a small exchange of practical gifts, because Roy had gone to Hargrove's and found a set of good quality writing paper and a bottle of proper ink and a small penknife for letter writing. And Opal had made him a wool muffler from some dark blue yarn she had traded sewing work for with a woman in town. Pete and Silas joined them for supper, and there was a bottle of whiskey from the pantry, and Opal made a molasses cake that Pete declared was the finest thing he had eaten in years. And Silas went so red at the compliment on Opal's behalf that Roy thought he might actually glow. There was a moment in the middle of that Christmas supper, Roy at the head of the table he had eaten alone at for too many years, Opal at the other end and Pete and Silas on the sides, the lamp burning and the molasses cake on the table, and the cold winter outside the windows. When Roy looked the full length of that table at Opal, and she looked back at him, and they shared a glance that was private and warm and contained everything that had happened between them in these months and the clear possibility of everything ahead. And Pete noticed, because Pete always noticed, and wisely said nothing whatsoever. January brought a stretch of bitter cold that kept the work close to home, and the days shorter in their useful light. Opal and Roy settled into a new kind of daily rhythm together, one in which the small physical clarities of their affection were present as a matter of course. He would touch her shoulder when he came in from the cold. She would correct the set of his collar before he went to town in a gesture so unconscious it surprised both of them the first time it happened. They sat in the evenings and read, and the parlor had the specific warmth of two people who have chosen to be in the same room rather than been placed there by circumstance. In February, Roy went to Caldwell and came back with a small ring, a plain gold band with a single chip of garnet that was the best the jeweler in town could offer. He came home at midday, which was unusual, and Opal looked at him from the kitchen with the immediate awareness of someone who reads the quality of an entrance the way Roy could read the weather. "You look like a man who has made a decision," she said. "I have made a decision," he said, "but I want to make it a question before I make it a decision, because the question is yours to answer." He took the ring from his vest pocket and held it out, and Opal looked at it and then at him, and her hands went still on the bread she had been kneading. "I want to marry you," Roy said, "because you are the person I want beside me for the rest of my life, and I have been quite certain about that since about the middle of October, even though I've been taking the time to be sure about it, and to make sure you had time to be sure about it in a situation that wasn't artificially constrained." He paused. "So I'm asking, without any of the rest of it as a factor, just the asking." Opal looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at Roy Whittaker, 30 years old, broad-shouldered, habitually honest. A man who had given her a room with a lock and a wage and her dead mother's books, and his sister's name and a warmth so steady and real that she had stopped being surprised by it only because she had learned it was simply who he was. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger and she brought her bread-floury hands up to his face and kissed him in the middle of the kitchen, and then she laughed, which was a sound he had been learning to collect over the months, and said, "My hands are covered in dough." "I noticed," he said. They were married on the 14th of March, 1883, by the pastor in Caldwell in the small stone church at the end of Main Street, with Pete Vargas as witness and Silas Dunn standing next to Pete looking stricken with emotion and trying to hide it. Dollars Marsh from the hotel came because Roy had quietly stopped in and asked her to, as a gesture toward the community, and the pastor's wife came because she had been curious about Opal since September and had decided by December that she liked her considerably. A few other ranching families came because they respected Roy and because word had gotten around Caldwell in the way things get around small towns, and the church was not full, but it was respectably attended. Opal wore the green calico dress. She had chosen it deliberately, and when Roy saw her come down the hallway from Clara's room that morning in the dress with its ivory piping and its mother-of-pearl buttons and the small mend at the hip, something moved through him that was both grief and joy in the particular compound that life creates when it insists on being complex and beautiful at the same time. He told her she was beautiful and meant it with everything he had. She told him he looked very well for a man who had fought so hard with his hair that morning, and they both laughed, and they went to the church and they made their promises to each other in front of the people of Caldwell, and then they came home to the ranch. That night, they lit the lamps in the parlor and sat together, and Opal leaned into him on the bench by the fire, and the house was very quiet around them, and she reached across and took his hand. "Are you happy?" she asked. He looked at the fire and the room and the edge of the kitchen beyond the parlor door, at the house that had been his sister's home and was now his wife's home, at this particular life that had arrived in such an unexpected shape. "I am extraordinarily happy," he said. She settled further into his shoulder. "Good," she said. "So am I." The spring of 1883 ran warm and early, and with it came the natural expansion of a working ranch that now had two minds applying themselves to its operations instead of one. Opal had been paying close attention to the financial side of the ranch all winter, not intrusively but with the quiet attention she applied to everything, and in April she sat Roy down with the ledger he kept in the parlor desk and said, "I want to show you something." What she showed him was a pattern in the cattle prices relative to the timing of the drives, a consistent spread that suggested Roy was selling 4 to 6 weeks too early each season and losing approximately $8 to $12 a head as a result. She had worked it out from 3 years of ledger entries with the careful analysis of someone who had taught herself arithmetic from library books. Roy stared at the numbers for a long time. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "I read a lot," she said, "and I pay attention." "If this is right," he said, "and I think it is, we've been leaving about $2,000 a year on the table." "Roughly," she said. Roy looked at his wife across the ledger with an expression that was partly the very practical response of a rancher to a significant financial insight, and partly something more fundamentally startled, the recognition of a capability in the person beside him that he had been in no way prepared for. "We're going to put this to use," he said. "That's why I showed you," she said. He adjusted the timing of the fall drive that year based on Opal's analysis, and it played out almost exactly as her numbers had predicted. and the difference in the year's take was substantial enough that Roy paid off the remaining bank note on the North Pasture 2 years ahead of schedule. The summer of 1883 brought a drought that hit the whole region and made the ranching work harder and longer, and Roy and Pete and Silas spent most of July and August working the water access points and moving cattle to the places where the grass still held, coming in at night tired in the bone-deep way of men who have spent the day fighting the land. Opal managed the household through it with a practicality that extended to rationing water for the kitchen garden and making the most of the preserved goods, and not adding to the anxiety of the house, but also not pretending the situation was less serious than it was. One evening in late July, Roy came in later than usual and found Opal at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low, and both of them were quiet for a while in the way of two people who are tired and worried and know it and have agreed without discussion not to pretend otherwise. "The south well is holding," Roy said finally. "Good," she said. "We'll lose some of the herd. Maybe 20, 30 head if it goes another 6 weeks dry." "I know," she said. "I've been going through the numbers for what we'd need to offset that." She slid a paper across the table. "If we sell the 2 breeding bulls in Wichita in August rather than the fall, the price won't be as good, but the cash will cover the shortfall if we lose 30 head and then some." Roy looked at the numbers. They were right. He reached across and covered her hand with his, and she turned hers over and gripped. "Thank you," he said. "We're a team," she said simply. The drought broke in September and the south well stayed good, and they lost 17 head, which was within the range Opal had planned for. The ranch came out of the drought season in better shape than most of the operations around them, and Roy credited the planning out loud at a ranchers' meeting in Caldwell in October, which embarrassed Opal when she heard about it and pleased her too, in equal measure. In November of 1883, Opal told Roy she was expecting their first child. He was in the barn when she told him, sitting on the fence of the near paddock after the morning's work with a cup of coffee, and she came across the yard in her coat, and he saw her face before she spoke, and he knew before she said it. When she said it, he was off the fence and had her in his arms before the last word was out, and she laughed into his shoulder, and he held her with the specific completeness of a man who has been given something he did not entirely know he had been hoping for. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I'm well," she said. "A little unsteady in the mornings, otherwise well." "We'll get Doc Reeves to come out," he said immediately. "There's time for that," she said. "I'm healthy, Roy, I'm not fragile." "I know you're not fragile," he said. "I also want Doc Reeves to come out." She pulled back and looked at him with a smile that was both fond and slightly exasperated, the particular combination that had become one of his favorite things in the world. "Fine," she said. "Get Doc Reeves." He got Doc Reeves, who came out the following Tuesday and confirmed everything and gave Opal a clean bill of health and shook Roy's hand with the slightly ceremonial enthusiasm of a country doctor who genuinely enjoys delivering good news for once. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was a good winter, meaning it was cold and hard in the necessary way of the country, but nothing disastrous. Roy built the crib himself in the spare room on the west side of the house that had been empty since he added it to the building 4 years ago, spending evenings in the woodshop by lamplight with the careful attention he gave to things he wanted done well. Pete and Silas made observations about the crib's progress that were ribald and affectionate by turns, and Opal told Silas his color was better when he was embarrassed, and watched him go scarlet with the gentle precision of someone who enjoys their power on occasion. The baby came in July of 1884, in the middle of a hot, still evening when the air held its breath, and the cicadas were very loud outside the windows. Doc Reeves was there, and a local midwife named Mrs. Aldred, who had delivered half the children in the county, and Roy was confined to the parlor below by a combination of medical authority and his own overwhelming anxiety, and Pete sat with him for 4 hours drinking coffee and saying very little, which was exactly the right thing. When Mrs. Aldred came to the parlor door and said, "Mr. Whittaker, you have a son." Roy was up the stairs before the sentence was fully out of her mouth. The boy was dark-haired and loud and entirely healthy, and Opal held him in the lamplight of the bedroom, with the exhaustion of the delivery still on her face, and a look beneath it that Roy would spend the rest of his life trying to adequately describe and never quite managing. Roy sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and looked at his wife and felt the specific gravity of a moment that rewrites everything before and after it. "He's extraordinary," he said. "He is quite loud," Opal said. "Which I think is a good sign. What do you want to call him?" She looked at the baby and then at Roy. "I thought, if you're willing, James for your father. And Thomas for the middle, which was my grandfather's name." Roy's throat was tight. "James Thomas Whittaker," he said. "Is that right?" "That is exactly right," Roy said. They wrote to Opal's brother in St. Louis, and he wrote back with genuine warmth, and to their mild surprise he announced that he and his wife planned to make the journey to Kansas the following spring. Opal read that letter aloud at the kitchen table, and there was a moistness about her eyes that she did not attempt to hide, and Roy reached across the table, and she took his hand without looking up from the letter. James Thomas Whittaker was a robust and opinionated baby who had strong feelings about his preferences, and expressed them without ambiguity. Opal managed his first year with the same calm capability she brought to everything, and Roy participated with a thoroughness that slightly surprised Pete, who had not expected a rancher of Roy's particular intensity of purpose to take to the domestic details of infant care with such obvious willingness. "He changes the boy himself," Pete reported to Silas with the gravity of a man reporting a significant natural phenomenon. "I changed the boy myself," Roy confirmed from the kitchen doorway. "I didn't know you were there," Pete said. "Yes, you did," Roy said. The spring of 1885 brought Opal's brother Daniel and his wife Louise to Caldwell on the Union Pacific, a journey that reversed the exact route Opal had made nearly 3 years before. Roy drove the wagon to the depot himself with Opal beside him, and James on her lap, and he watched the train arrive with a clarity of awareness about the circularity of things that he usually did not think about in those terms. The reunion between Opal and her brother had the quality of two people who love each other and have been at a distance longer than was good for either of them. And Roy stood at a respectful remove and let it happen. And when Daniel turned to him and shook his hand with a directness that was clearly a family trait, Roy felt the particular satisfaction of meeting someone who reminded him of a person he already loved. Daniel and Louise stayed for 2 weeks, sleeping in the west room that had been recently cleared and cleaned for the purpose, and the house was fuller than it had been since before Clara died, full of voices and the additional noise of James discovering his enthusiasm for an audience. On the second evening, after supper, Daniel and Roy sat on the porch in the cooling air, and Roy described the ranch and its operations, and Daniel listened with an attention that Roy recognized as Opal's, the specific quality of an intelligent person absorbing information rather than waiting for their turn to speak. "She seems genuinely happy," Daniel said at one point. "I need you to know that I was worried about her when she wrote to say she was marrying a man she'd met at a Kansas train depot 3 months before. I was fairly worried." "That's fair," Roy said. "She writes about you the way people write when they mean it," Daniel said. "Not the way people write when they're performing contentment for the benefit of family who might otherwise worry." "I am glad to hear that," Roy said, and meant it deeply. "You've been good to her," Daniel said, and the simplicity of it was an endorsement from a man who had grown up in the same household as Opal and knew exactly what it meant for her to be well cared for by the people around her. That night, after Daniel and Louise had gone to bed and James was sleeping and the house was quiet, Opal came out onto the porch where Roy was still sitting and stood beside him, and he pulled her down onto the bench next to him, and she leaned against him, and they looked out over the ranch in the dark, the outlines of the barn and the bunkhouse and the paddock visible in the faint moonlight. "He likes you," she said. "I think he's reserving the full endorsement." "He gave you the partial endorsement, which is significant. Daniel doesn't give partial endorsements easily. She paused. Thank you for this, for bringing them here, for making this a place I could bring them to. Roy held her close in the night air. This is your home, he said. That's what home is for. She turned her face up to his in the dark, and he kissed her with the unhurried quality of a man who knows he has time, which is one of the great luxuries of a love that has decided to be permanent. Silas Dunn, in the fall of 1885, announced with enormous embarrassment and considerable excitement that he was engaged to marry the schoolteacher's youngest daughter, a quiet girl named Nell, who had apparently been aware of Silas's existence since the spring, and had done the entire work of making the relationship happen, because Silas was constitutionally incapable of initiating anything with a woman he was interested in. Roy and Opal hosted the engagement supper, Opal's idea executed with characteristic thoroughness, and Nell proved to be a composed and gentle young woman who had clearly looked at Silas Dunn and seen something true and good in him that his awkwardness concealed from most people. Opal told Roy later that she liked Nell enormously, and that the match was a good one, and Roy said he thought so too, and that he hoped Silas understood what he had. Silas understands more than he seems to, Opal said. That's one of the things about him. You're right, Roy said, it is. By the end of 1885, the Whitaker Ranch had grown to nearly 450 head. The North Pasture extension that Roy had been eyeing for 2 years was within financial reach, and the house itself had been extended by a room on the back, built during the summer months with Pete's help and the assistance of a carpenter from town, to create a proper study, where Opal's mother's books now lived on 2 proper shelves that Roy had built himself over a series of winter evenings. Opal's writing desk was in that study, and the writing paper and ink he had given her for Christmas in 1882, long since replenished, was where she wrote her letters and had recently begun filling the pages of a journal in the small, precise handwriting that Roy had come to love the way you love a person's handwriting, as a specific and irreducible expression of who they are. James walked at 11 months and talked with conviction at 14, and showed every early sign of being a child with his mother's intelligence and his father's stubbornness, in a combination that Roy considered both wonderful and potentially challenging. He was deeply interested in the animals of the ranch from the very start, following Roy to the barn from the moment he was physically able to totter across the yard, and Pete adopted a sort of gruff uncle role with him that everyone pretended not to find as endearing as they did. One afternoon in the spring of 1886, when James was almost 2 and Roy was patching the south barn roof and Pete was holding the ladder below, and Silas was in the near paddock with the new foal, Opal came across the yard and waited at the base of the ladder until Roy looked down. The look on her face told him before the words. Again, he said. She smiled up at him with a warmth that made the spring light seem almost incidental. Again, she said. He came down the ladder with considerably more haste than the situation strictly required, and Pete stepped back with the knowing expression of a man who has learned when to give ground, and Roy came to Opal and held her face in his hands, careful and deliberate as always, and she leaned into his palms. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I'm also going to need more shelving in the study before the end of the year because I've been corresponding with a book dealer in Kansas City and I anticipate several more arrivals." "Books," Roy said. "And a baby," she said. "Both are welcome," he said. "The baby more than the books, but the books are a close second." She laughed at that and he kissed her forehead and she went back to the house and Pete climbed up the ladder past Roy and said, without preamble, "How many do you want?" "As many as she wants," Roy said. "Good answer," said Pete. The second child was born in November of 1886. A girl this time, smaller than James had been and quieter from the first breath. A baby who seemed to arrive with a watchful calm about her that was both peaceful and slightly uncanny. Opal said she looked like she was thinking things over, and Roy said that would make her very much her mother's daughter, and Opal gave him the look that was both fond and exasperated, and said that was the nicest thing she had heard all week. They named her Clara June, for Roy's sister and Opal's, and the combined naming felt to both of them like a right thing, a way of carrying the people they had lost in the new person they were given. James, who was 2.5, regarded his sister with the particular mixture of fascination and mild suspicion of a child who has previously had exclusive authority over his household, and then decided after about a week that she was acceptable, and thereafter became her fiercest protector, a role he would maintain throughout both their childhoods with a seriousness that Roy recognized as his own impulse expressed in small and earnest form. Christmas of 1886 was the fullest the house had been, with Daniel and Louise having made the journey again, because Louise was expecting their own first child the following spring, and had expressed a desire to spend the holiday with Opal, which Roy supported because he had by this time formed a genuine regard for Daniel and found Louise to be a person of considerable wit and warmth. Pete and Silas and Nell were there for Christmas dinner, and Silas and Nell had married that October in a simple ceremony in town that Roy and Opal had attended, and at which Silas had cried openly, and without shame, and Roy had decided he liked him more than ever for it. The house was loud with conversation and James's particular style of toddler communication, and the smell of everything Opal and Louise had cooked together, and Roy sat at his table and looked at all of it with the quiet astonishment that had become his primary internal response to his own life. He caught Opal's eye across the table at one point, in the middle of everything, in the middle of all the noise and the people and the food and the lamplight and the small sleeping weight of Clara June in the cradle near the stove. And the look they exchanged across that table was the whole story contained in a glance. From the depot platform on a summer afternoon in 1882 to this crowded December kitchen 3.5 years later, from a woman in a dead woman's dress with 60 cents to this. From a man leaning against a post, watching a train, to a man who had come to understand that the post he had been leaning against for too many years had been between him and the world, and that he had not known he needed someone to walk him away from it. He raised his coffee cup very slightly in her direction. She touched the garnet ring on her finger and smiled at him. After Christmas, after Daniel and Louise had gone back to St. Louis, after the new year had turned, and 1887 arrived in the particular way that New Year's arrive on a working ranch, which is with the pressing continuity of the work rather than any sense of ceremonial pause. Roy and Opal stood together on the porch one evening in January in the cold, clear air, with the stars enormous overhead and James asleep inside, and Clara June in the small cradle that Roy had carried to the parlor for the warmth. "What does the year look like?" Opal asked. She was not asking about the weather or the cattle market, not primarily. She was asking the broader version of the question. "Good," Roy said. "The year looks genuinely good." She leaned into his side and he put his arm around her, and they looked out at the Kansas winter together, at the dark shapes of the barn and the bunkhouse and the paddock fence, at the land that stretched away in all directions under the hard winter sky. "I want to tell you something," Opal said. "Tell me." "When I stepped off that train," she said, "I had nothing and no real plan, and I was more frightened than I was letting myself know. And then you walked up and told me that the dress I was wearing had belonged to your sister, and I thought you were about to ask for it back, and instead you told me to keep it and you fed me supper." She paused. "I didn't know then what kind of person you were, but I remember thinking, this person is trying to take care of the situation in front of them without making it a performance. And that was the first real thing I knew about you, that you do the right thing without needing it to look a certain way." Roy was quiet for a moment. "I remember thinking you were the most controlled, frightened person I had ever seen," he said. She laughed softly. "I was terrified. I know. I could see it if I looked right, but you weren't going to let it get the better of you." He looked at the sky. "That was the first real thing I knew about you." She tilted her head up and he looked down, and they were both smiling in the cold January dark, "We figured each other out," she said. "We did," he said. "We did very thoroughly." The years that followed had the full texture of a real and abundant life. The ranch grew and prospered under their combined management, reaching 560 head by 1889, and the North Pasture extension was purchased outright in the fall of 1888 after the best cattle year they had run. Roy put Opal's name on the deed alongside his, which she found out about when the lawyer in Caldwell showed her the paperwork, and she came home with the paper in her hand and found Roy in the kitchen and did not say anything but stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with an expression that made him put down what he was doing and come to her. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know I didn't have to," he said. "That's the point." She put her arms around him, and he held her in the kitchen of the house that was both of theirs and had always been both of theirs, even before the paperwork made it official. Pete Vargas met a widow woman named Rosaria from the Mexican community in the south of the county in 1889, a sharp and generous woman with 3 children of her own, and their courtship was conducted with a gravity and steadiness that Roy recognized as Pete's truest expression of himself. They married in 1890 in a simple ceremony, and Pete stayed on the Whitaker Ranch, but moved from the bunkhouse into a small house he built on the east edge of the property that Roy offered him as part of his agreement, a piece of land and the right to build on it, which Pete accepted with the dignity of a man who has worked for something real and is not ashamed to receive it. Silas and Nell moved to a small farm they purchased on the North Road in 1890 as well, which meant Roy and Opal needed additional ranch hands, and they hired 2 men, brothers named Francis and Clem Abbott from a family that had been farming the territory for a decade, solid workers who slotted into the bunkhouse, and the ranch routine without drama. James Whitaker grew into a boy of startling practical capability, and his mother's precise intelligence, deeply interested in the running of the ranch, and already capable by the age of 8 of assisting with real work, sorting cattle and mending smaller fence repairs with a seriousness that made Roy quietly proud in the way that is deeper than the stated version. Clara June was a different sort of child, quieter and more interior than her brother, with the watchful quality she had shown from birth and a remarkable memory for details. The things people said, the way plants grew, the specific colors of the sky at different times of day. By the time she was 5, she had read every book her mother owned that was appropriate for her age and was requesting more, and Opal wrote to the book dealer in Kansas City with renewed frequency. Roy watched his daughter move through the world with the particular attention of a father who recognizes in a child not just love but a person worth knowing deeply, and he made a habit of taking her with him on the gentler ranch work the way he had taken James, not because it was practical but because she was interested, and because he believed that children who are interested in things should be allowed access to those things. One autumn afternoon when Clara June was 7, she asked Roy while they were sitting on the paddock fence watching the horses why he had given her mother her Auntie Clara's dress rather than asking for it back when she arrived. Roy thought about this for a moment. "Because it was already hers by the time I saw her in it," he said. "Your Aunt Clara gave that dress away because she would have wanted someone to have it, and the someone who had it was your mother. That seemed like a right thing." Clara June thought about this with the gravity of a 7-year-old applying serious consideration to a serious question. "Did you know you were going to love Mama right then?" "No," Roy said honestly. "I just knew I wasn't going to ask for the dress back." "But that was the start of it," she said. "Yes," Roy said. "I suppose that was the start of it." She nodded slowly, satisfied by this, and they sat together on the fence in the autumn afternoon watching the horses, and the ranch stretched out around them under the enormous Kansas sky, real and full and enduringly theirs. Opal found him there a little while later, coming across the yard with her coat on, and her dark hair going silver at the temples now, the years present in her but not diminishing, only adding to the specific beauty of who she was, which Roy had always thought was best described as a person who had decided to be fully herself, and had found that this was the most powerful decision available to anyone. She leaned on the fence beside him, and Clara June slid over to make room with the automatic cooperation of a child comfortable in her place. "Supper in 20 minutes, Opal said. "We'll be there," Roy said. She looked at him over Clara June's head with the look he had been learning since the depot platform in 1882, the look that contained all of it: the green calico dress, and the 60 cents, and the parlor bench, and the ledger, and the children, and the land, and the years of ordinary and extraordinary days laid end to end into something that was not just a life, but the best possible version of a life. He reached across Clara June's small shoulders and covered Opal's hand where it rested on the fence post, and her fingers closed around his with the ease of absolute familiarity, and something beyond that, the warmth that does not diminish with time but deepens, that does not become habit in the deadening sense, but instead becomes the foundation on which everything else is built, reliable and permanent and still, even now, capable of making him feel that the world had arranged itself correctly. "Come to supper," Opal said softly. "Coming," Roy said. Clara June jumped down from the fence and ran ahead to the house, her boots loud on the packed earth, and Roy and Opal walked behind her across the yard in the amber autumn light, their hands still joined, toward the lamplit house that was theirs, toward the smell of supper and the sound of James already at the table asking about something with the focused energy he applied to all questions, toward Pete and Rosaria visible in the distance at their East Edge house, toward the life that had begun with a dress on a depot platform and had grown into this, into all of this, into more than either of them had known to ask for. The door of the ranch house opened, and warm light spilled out, and Clara June disappeared inside, and James's voice rose in cheerful demand, and Opal squeezed Roy's hand and looked up at him in the threshold of the door and said, with the simple completeness of a woman who means every syllable of what she says, "I am so glad you walked up to that platform." Roy looked at his wife in the light of their home and felt the full weight of the years and the grace of them and said, "So am I, Opal, every single day." They went inside and closed the door on the autumn evening, and the windows of the Whitaker ranch house glowed warm against the deepening dark, and the land was quiet around it, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to happen had happened, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.